There are few things that itch our human brain's creativity more than a great mystery. Something about good stories and narratives do a great job of dragging us in. Me being an aerospace nerd, the greatest mystery was Malaysian Airlines Flight 370. For the uninitiated, allow me to set the stage. Flight 370 is a daily service from Kuala Lumpur International Airport in Malaysia to Beijing Capital City Airport in China. It's March 8, 2014, and just past midnight, Flight 370 has already taken off from Kuala Lumpur. A mere 30 minutes into the flight, we've already reached our cruising altitude and are getting ready to enter Vietnamese airspace. As is customary, the flight controllers in the Malaysian airport instruct the flight to contact Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam as we're now about to enter their airspace. Here's how that conversation went down.
Malaysian 370, contact Ho Chi Minh 120.9. Good night. Good night, Malaysian 370.
Now at this point, Flight 370 was supposed to contact Ho Chi Minh City as we're now entering Vietnamese airspace, but that never happened. A minute after that transmission was made, Flight 370 vanished from radar screens across the globe and was never heard from again. Those were its final words. After missing its scheduled arrival time nearly 4 hours later in China, the most expensive and biggest search in aviation history is about to take place. I was hooked. I knew this is what I wanted to share with you guys. Speaking of what I'm going to share, I'd like to shed some light on the investigation that followed, what the probable causes were for the crash, and what the aviation industry had learned from this incident. We will begin our journey by looking at the investigation surrounding Flight 370. Their initial goal was to actually plot the path of the flight after it had disappeared. According to the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, the location signal comes from two transponders in the front of the aircraft. Since Flight 370 vanished from radar, this means both of those transponders stopped working. However, military radar is not subject to this because it works off of reflectance from aircraft. Malaysian military was able to track the aircraft, and this is what their data showed. The data showed that the aircraft had made a prolonged turn back towards Malaysia after losing contact. Then it flew back over the peninsula before making a slight turn to the left over Penang Island, where it then exited the range of the radar system. While this was a huge lead for the investigators, sadly the search and rescue teams on the ground were unable to find any wreckage, so the investigators switched tactics and started looking at the satellite communication logs of the aircraft. According to the French Aviation Safety Bureau, every modern airliner is equipped with what's known as a SATCOM, or a satellite communications terminal. It essentially allows the crew to talk with the ground in the first place. While the pilots on MH370 never used the satellite terminal after the disappearance, the terminal is actually programmed on an hourly basis to send out a message to the network and to show that it's still there online. Flight 370 actually apparently remained connected for more than 6 hours after the original disappearance, meaning that in total, about 7 status requests were sent. Similar to how you would measure the distance of lightning by counting the number of seconds from the flash, the investigators were able to calculate the delay from the satellite and generate 7 rings on the Earth's surface where they believed those signals originated. By running a lot of computer simulations of the flight path, investigators concluded that the final resting place of Flight 370 was somewhere along this arc in the Indian Ocean. Thanks to this new data, the investigators now had a way more definitive answer to where MH370 was than they've ever had before, and a multinational crew of search and rescue experts spent months and billions of dollars scouring every inch of the arc, but ultimately no wreckage was found. And nothing would be found until over 16 months later, when a part of the MH370 aircraft washed up on the shore of Reunion Island off of the coast of Africa. The U.S. National Transportation and Safety Board, NTSB, ordered a search of a lot of coastlines in Africa, and as the report states, they recovered at least 31 additional items of interest, 16 of which were deemed to be certainly or highly likely to have originated from Flight 370, while the remaining objects could not be confirmed or identified. Sadly, at this point, it seemed as though the investigation was just doomed to fail. It was consuming over $700,000 per day, and it was just too much for a lot of countries to handle. So, on January of 2017, the search was completely called off with little to no findings to speak of. However, This doesn't mean there have been a shortage of theories. There have been a lot of theories, and we're going to explore 3 of them. Starting with the hijacking theory. On Flight 370, it was exposed that 2 passengers were traveling on stolen passports. However, Malaysian investigators were never able to link the 2 men to any terrorist groups, and a lengthy report done by the USA's FBI was unable to link them to any terrorist groups either. Additionally, they added that these passengers were actually planning to seek asylum in China once they arrived, and were not traveling on stolen passports due to any nefarious intent. Ultimately, this theory was scrapped as soon as it was brought up. The second more plausible theory is that there was a fire on board. Many investigators believe that the first turn back towards Malaysia was a direct response to an onboard fire, which makes sense because if there was a large fire on board, it could have knocked out the electrical systems, and therefore explaining why the transponders went out. However, this theory has largely been dismissed because there's a lack of any fire or explosion evidence on any of the recovered pieces. This brings me swiftly to the third and final theory, which is the pilot-instigated hijacking. This theory started taking root because it's super hard to explain those weird alterations in trajectory that Flight 370 had throughout its travels. A report published by Boeing, who was the manufacturer of this aircraft, showed that the first turn back towards the Malaysian peninsula had to be done manually, because the angle required to make that turn was greater than what the autopilot systems would have allowed for. The remaining turns, however, could have been done either manually or initiated by the autopilot. But in either case, there had to be some sort of crew involvement. Someone with the requisite knowledge must have made those turns by hand or punched the coordinates into the autopilot. There is an involvement. The suspicion was furthered when in June of 2014, a leaked report showed that Malaysian officials were actually interrogating family and friends of these pilots to look for answers. However, they wouldn't find any answers. The bizarre thing is there was nothing abnormal revealed about these pilots' lives. None of the crew members showed any history of abuse of substances or any recent changes in behaviors. Looking at the family side of things, they were all in very great condition, and none of the crew members showed any financial troubles before the flight had originated. At the end of the day, the co-pilot Farik Abdul Hamid was actually due to marry a pilot after he had landed in China. The pilot Zahari Ahmad Shah was married and had 3 children. Ultimately, it was just decided that there was no real way that the pilots would have ditched the aircraft, or at least there was no motive to do so. So, what is one to make of all of this? Every theory we've come up with so far seems to get debunked so quickly, which makes sense because there's such a lack of evidence to substantiate any one of these theories. We need more information. This lack of evidence is so dire, in fact, that the 1,500-page long Malaysian official report ends with this very, very anticlimactic conclusion. Check it out. The team is unable to determine the real cause for disappearance of Flight 370. While there are sadly no answers to be found, the aviation industry certainly did learn a lot from this incident. For instance, the transponders on board the aircraft, the location devices that went offline, were actually switched over to automated transponders. This means that the crew couldn't turn off any tracking capability manually in order to evade any detection. Second of all, better electronics were added to the airplane to ensure that any type of onboard fire would not damage the electronics, meaning that any sort of fire on board would not disable the location systems, and thereby the tracking systems. Finally, the satellite communication terminal interval was switched from 1 hour to 15 minutes in order to provide a lot more data and to promote better data logging practices. Finally, the black boxes of the airplane's lives were extended from 30 days to 90 days, giving investigators much more flexibility when it comes to investigating air crashes. It's really clear that the industry has learned a lot, but given at the current pace, it's very likely that the actual truth behind Flight 370 won't be discovered within our lifetimes. We will be missing it, but don't let that bog you down. There are so many things that we get to witness in our lives that our ancestors will be missing. Take, for example, the birth of the internet, the first picture of a black hole. And most importantly, they will miss you, the you that's here at this very moment. Until that time, however, I hope you look up at the MH370 incident as a constant reminder to stay curious and to always keep looking for answers. Thank you for being a great audience.